So we've been looking at Revelation 13, and we were going through a Spirit of Prophecy quote where Sister White identifies that Revelation 13, verse 11, the term coming up out of the earth, coming up, is identifying the same word as coming up as a plant here. And she marks that in 1798. And we said that if you bring that terminology of coming up out of the earth, springing up as a plant, to the agricultural model, it brings you to this point here. And that's what we've been discussing so far. We've been looking at Revelation 13 and breaking down its theme, doing a little bit of an exercise with that, using different ways to approach it. And we've been looking at doing a compare and contrast, looked at some of the other models. But this is where we are presently, looking at the compare and contrast between the sea beast and the land beast. So the point we ended on just moments ago was this idea of problem and a solution. So we've identified that the problem in the agricultural model is the fallow field. It's what stands in the way of enacting the rest of the agricultural cycle of plowing the field, of planting everything. That's sort of the obstacle here, and the solution to that is to plow. So the problem's the field, the fallow field. The answer is plowing the field and beginning that process. So when we bring that to our instance of Revelation 13, what we identified was that we have these two beasts, the first beast and the second beast, sea beast and the land beast, and the first beast is a persecuting power. It's represented by a lion, a bear, a leopard, and a dragon, and these four entities are all carnivores, they're all persecutors, and we identified that this is the problem in the chapter, persecution. The answer to that problem was in the contrasting beast. Here we see the land beast, and the land beast is represented in part by a lamb. Though we did identify the fact that there's this dragon characteristic, but what we said is that you can't be a dragon and a lamb at the same time because they both represent character, so types of character, and you can't have good character and bad character at the same time. So what we identified was that there's some transition that takes place from a lamb to a dragon, but if we just step back from that transition point for a moment, what we see here is that the land beast is the answer to the problem of the sea beast, or it's the consequence, so to speak, or the solution, if we look at it in that regard here. So what we say there, if we overlay the entities of these beasts that we know that the sea beast is who? Who's the sea beast? It is Rome, but it's specifically papal. Papal Europe, I guess, would probably be the best way to say it. And who's the land beast? The USA. So, yep. What? We're just saying the USA right now. Yeah, just USA in general, in all its states. As a republic, and I guess it will encompass the period of a dragon as well, which would be the Romanesque period. So we have papal Europe, and the solution to that, the contrast to that, is the land beast here, with the land beast, or the beast that's represented at least in part by a lamb. So problem and solution. Persecution, so if we have persecution here, from all of these, what is the opposite of persecution? What's the opposite of what? Peace, okay. Freedom, liberty, that kind of concept, all those work. What? Freedom of conscience. So you have lack of conscience, you have persecution of conscience, freedom of conscience, and then you have freedom of conscience here. All of those work, all those different contrasting symbols. So once we know this is persecution, and we know that this land beast here is the opposite of this beast, then we can say that this must be the opposite of which is liberty or freedom of conscience, all those different entities. So now we sort of have a theme that we're operating off of to some degree, because the United States, what this line is showing us is the life of the United States. And 1798 is when it is established as a nation. We can get that from the paragraph that we read. And what we see here with this is that if the establishment of the life is here, it means that there's this time period where there's this history before of the plowing where the problem is going to be in part dealt with. And again, we said the problem is this barren, this fallow field. So the fallow field gets dealt with somehow before 1798. So what did we just identify as the problem? What did we say? What? It's the fallow ground. What is it in the context of the United States? What is the problem that they need to deal with? Colonialism, their colony of Britain. They're a colony of Europe. So for us to let's get into that a little bit. So when did people flee Europe? When did that take place? Anyone know? Long time ago. From Europe to the United States. 1600s. So, long time ago, well before 1798, they have fled Europe. But what is the problem now? So they've changed geography. You know, the issue of geography. They've changed geography, but has that solved the problem? No, because what's the problem? Persecution. And in the context here, we could label it different. We could just say persecution, but we could say it's being under the influence of Papal Europe. So that is the problem that they're facing. It's the symbolism of the old world and all the baggage that comes with the old world. So how are they going to deal with the problem of the old world? What?
Create a solution.
A what?
A
What
solution.
is the solution?
The Declaration, the Constitution,
The revolution. So the revolution is going to be their solution to this problem. Because again, remember, the problem is that they may have, if this is Europe, and this is North America, we'll just say, they may have left and come over here, but all they've exposed is the fact that the chain that comes from Europe is very long. And it can be on their ankle all the way across the Atlantic. It spans that far. And even though they're here, they're still colonists and they're still under the influence of Europe and specifically under its oppression. And we'll talk more about that momentarily. So that's where the United States, or the Pilgrims or the colonies, find themselves at this time. So even though they left in the 1600s, the problem has not been dealt with. It's just in the process of being dealt with. They're creating a situation where they can deal with it. And the point in which they actually sever this tie, this chain that binds them, is, as you all have said, is in 1776. 1776 with the American Revolution. So we'll just call this say again? The monarchical system, yes. And we'll mention that. We can mention that right now. So part of this situation here is that what is the political system of the sea beast, as our brother said? Monarchy. So this is monarchy over here. What is the political system of the land beast? Republicanism. So there's even in the system that they're going to have, the system of the sea beast and the system of the land beast, even those will be opposites, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Going into this, everything is going to be the exact opposite of that previous system, pretty much everything. So I want to finish our quotation that we were looking at. We were reading from Great Controversy 440, and now I want to look at the next paragraph. This is Great Controversy 441. It starts going on to that page. And Sister White's going to be continuing her discussion of Revelation 13, and she's going to identify some themes for us. And we want to take a look at that here for just a moment. So, Great Controversy 441. And he had two horns like a lamb. The lamb-like horns indicate the youth, innocence, and gentleness fitly representing the character of the United States when presented to the prophet as coming up in 1798. So here she's telling us 1798, this lamb-likeness is gentleness, docility, how'd she say, innocence, youth, gentleness. All those things fitly represent the character. And as we said before, these animals represent the character of their respective beasts. So this beast is, at this point, lamb-like. Okay. So, continuing on. The Christian exiles who first fled to America sought asylum. The Christian exiles, we said that happened in the 1600s. The Christian exiles who first fled to America sought an asylum from royal oppression and priestly intolerance. And they determined to establish government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberty. So, does anyone have that paragraph in front of them? Yeah. Okay. So what has she just done in that sentence? She says, I'll read it one more time. Sought an asylum from royal oppression and priestly intolerance, and they determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberty. What do we see in that sentence there? Let me ask it this way. Let me sort of hone us in. What issue of methodology do we see identified in that sentence? What? Repeat and enlarge. How do you see it in that sentence? Repeat and enlarge. Do you have it in front of you?
I think she's defining what the two horns are.
So in that one sentence, she's using a point of methodology. Don't look at the sentence before, just the sentence that starts the Christian exile. What do we see?
Compare and contrast.
How?
Because he's talking about the oppression that they were under and contrasting what they will face. They'll have civil and religious liberty.
Amen. So she's identifying, she's doing a compare and contrast here between what the system was and what it's going to be. And so let's just look at that for a moment. So what are the two things? What are the bad points that she mentions? Royal oppression, priestly intolerance. Royal oppression and priestly intolerance. Tell me about those two things. What are they? What is royal oppression? What does that have to do with? Monarchy, okay. What aspect of society monarchy works? Different word. The government. What's another word for government? Civil. So this is the civil aspect. So this is civil oppression. Civil. And what is priestly intolerance? Religious. So we have religious here. And that is being contrasted. I'll just put verses. What are the two things that she identifies for the contrast? Civil, and religious liberty. Do we see that? So that's our compare and contrast. So let's continue reading. The Declaration of Independence sets forth the great truths that all men are created equal and endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Constitution guarantees the people the right of self-government, providing that representatives elected by the popular vote shall enact and administer the laws. Freedom of religious faith was also granted every man, being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. So what has she done there in those couple sentences we read? I'll read them again. So remember what she's just done. So she's just made a compare and contrast between royal oppression and priestly intolerance. So civil and religious oppression versus civil liberty and religious liberty. She made that compare and contrast. So now what methodology is she using in these next sentences? I'll read it again. The Declaration of Independence sets forth the great truth that all men are created equal and endowed with their Creator, endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the Constitution guarantees to the people the right of self-government, providing that the representatives elected by the popular vote shall enact and administer the laws. Freedom of religious faith was also granted every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. I'll read one more sentence. Republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of the nation. So what has she done? She's enlarging upon what? Which part of the previous sentence? She's repeat enlarging on this section here. So give me the key words of her repeat and enlarge. She does 2 repeat and enlarges. I'll give you that hint. What's the first one? That's the second one. Well,
The Declaration of Independence is the first thing she mentions, and then the Constitution.
no. She's going to take these principles of civil liberty and religious liberty and say the same thing, but in a different... That's one of them. That's the second one. So I'll put here, that is, what is civil? Civil would be republicanism. Republicanism. And republicanism and Protestantism. There's one in the middle, though, in between civil liberty, that sentence, and here. Can anyone see it? So what does she say about the Constitution? What does it guarantee? The what? The right of self-government. What is self-government? What kind of liberty is that? It's civil liberty. That's civil liberty. So this is self-governance. Self-government. And then what does she say after that? She says, providing that they, and then she kind of elaborates on that, and what does she say? Freedom of religious faith was also granted. So now she's also talking about freedom of religious faith. So that's our other repeat and enlarge. Freedom of faith, we'll just say. Freedom of faith. So what she does is she gives this initially, she does this. She gives you a compare and contrast, and then she starts giving you repeat and enlarge. She sets the dichotomy up with compare and contrast, and then she's going to go here and explain what she means by civil liberty and religious liberty. Do we see that? Yeah. Okay. So civil liberty here is the same thing as self-government, and it's the same thing as republicanism, right? So the same thing can be said for the other side. Religious liberty is the same thing of freedom of faith, and it's the same thing as Protestantism. Okay, do we see that? We see that compare and contrast and repeat and enlarge? So now that we have that, here I'll move this. So the first thing she does is that way, and then the second thing is here. She's going to go down. Okay, so let's look at this for just a moment. Now, what's really cool about this passage is that when we look at Protestantism is an issue. What is the issue of Protestantism? What's, how do I say that? Today, what's the problem with Protestantism?
Their condition?
Their condition. What do you mean?
They're political.
What?
They're political. They have politicized.
Okay, they're political or they're apostate, you could say. So what has my sister just done? What is she identifying Protestantism as? She's identified Protestantism as a faith. Do you see how we did that? You know, when we think of Protestantism, what we think of is that Protestantism is a faith. We think of it as a group of, basically the evangelicals, Protestant Christians. But what's the problem with that? The problem is this. If we continue to read, it says, Republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of the nation. These principles are the secret of its power and prosperity. And basically, she'll go to say that if for the country to be taken down, Protestantism and Republicanism need to be attacked or need to be brought down. So the problem that we've just made is what we're saying is that Protestantism as a faith is the secret and the power of the United States. So what have we just done? We've made the United States a Protestant nation, a Christian nation, by saying that the secret of its power and success is the fact that it's religious Protestant. Now, what's the problem with that? It's contradictory to the idea of religious freedom. If I say I have a nation that is Protestant or Christian nation, it doesn't actually profess religious freedom. It just says that we are Protestant and that's our official faith. So initially, this quote of Republicanism and Protestantism creates a problem, and we have all fallen into this trap in previous ages before, in previous times, in the way in which we relate to the issue of Protestantism. We think of Protestantism as a faith in this context of this quote, but in the context of this quote, it's not a faith.
I had a question to pose because when Protestantism was first coined, it was through the actions of those princes and their protests against Catholicism and the anger they had over religious expression. So Protestantism in and of itself is a contrarian to Catholicism, which is what Romanism was a representation of. So even in Republicanism and Protestantism, you see an opposite to what the old world represented. And I think that's the highlight of what Ellen White is speaking to. It's not Protestantism as we understand it today, but Protestantism as it existed previously.
Amen. Exactly. That's the problem with this quote, is that when we, maybe not we, we understand this, but when many read this quote, they think of Protestantism as a faith, instead of identifying Protestantism as a principle, because the situation that Sister Antonisha is identifying is the Diet of Spires, where the German princes are going to come to the Pope, and during this convocation, this meeting, and they're basically going to say, enough is enough, stop dictating to us. You're the church, we're the state, we don't listen to you. You focus on church things, we'll focus on government things. Now, in that action, the essence in the beginning of Protestantism is not a religious act. It is actually a civil act. It's the civil act of separating church and state. So even the context, using, as Sister Antonisha is talking about, the origins of Protestantism as it should be understood, has nothing to do necessarily with what religion you ascribe to. It's more about the idea of separating church and state and allowing for religious freedom. And so that can be seen, if you just take this quote without the repeat and enlarge, you can see that by using the history of Protestantism. But this quotation, what it does is it easily helps you to identify exactly what she means that she's not talking about Protestantism as a faith, she's talking about it as a separation of church and state principle. By doing this, repeat and enlarge. Civil liberty equals self-government equals republicanism. Religious liberty equals freedom of faith equals Protestantism. Do we see that? So you can use repeat and enlarge and the context of the history to identify what these terms mean. These terms we know are infinitely important because, one, they're on the chart, but two, they become the governing principles and themes of the United States, or from its conception all the way to its end, and these become the points of attack. What is really interesting about this, if we put this another way, is what does republicanism deal with? What system? Government. What is government? Civil. What does civil mean? When I say something civil, it deals with people. It deals with what relationship? It deals with the relationship with one another. When we look at each other, so if we're government, if we're going to set up a government, what we're dealing with is how all of us are going to interact with each other. It deals with all the things how the rules and regulations and our interactions between each other, okay? We're not going to kill each other. We're not going to steal from each other. We're going to treat each other fairly, hopefully. Whatever it may be. It's the relationship between one another. Do we see that? So what is that? What principle did we identify yesterday?
Neighbor.
What?
Neighbor.
I can't hear you.
When we look at the Ten Commandments, and that would be
Your neighbor.
interaction with our neighbor.
Amen. So this republicanism is dealing with the interaction with your neighbor. So on an institutional, governmental level as a nation, the United States was fulfilling the injunction, at least in principle, of a love for your neighbor here. So this is the first principle, neighbor. And what is Protestantism? The separation of church and state. It's dealing with the relationship with God, the role of God in society, and how that needs to be an individual determination, and that's between God and the individual. So here, this deals with the relationship of the individual to God. That state, the church and the state should not come together to force those ideas onto other people. So here, even in the terms of republicanism and Protestantism, we see the two great principles of love for God and love for neighbor. So here we'll do it the other way around. Love for God and love for neighbor, which we identified was the 6 and the 4 in the Ten Commandments. So even in something so fundamental and so macro scale as republicanism and Protestantism, these principles are present. And what's amazing is it's telling us that if these principles of a love for God and a love for neighbor on an institutional, national level make a nation great. It becomes the power of your success and your prosperity. If you want to have a good nation, if you want to have a nation that's prosperous and successful and powerful in a good way, then have a nation that's built on the principles of love for a correct understanding of God, a love for God, and a love for neighbor. But in terms of God there, it's the separation of God from the state.
What does the one and the two represent?
Say again?
What does the one and the two represent?
The two principles. Love for God and love for neighbor, just those two principles. These ones here, this one is a repeat and enlarge, compare and contrast, and that's why it's horizontal. And this one is repeat and enlarge vertical. So one thing that we're going to talk about a little bit in some amount of detail, maybe not a ton of detail, maybe this might be all we mention of it, depending on how time goes, but is the idea of scalability. That you can take a concept or a principle and scale it to different sizes. And we spoke about this in the last presentation when we were dealing with methodology. We said when you have a theme, your theme needs to be applied at the small scale of Revelation 13 that you were looking at, but also in the macro level of the line that you're constructing. You need to find the theme of both. And in both cases, that theme is the same, of persecution persecution versus liberty, generically. So that same principle of scalability also works for something like the two great commandments of love for God and love for neighbor, in that you can scale that from the individual level, that me as an individual, I need to love my neighbor and love God, but I can also scale that up as an institution, as a ministry. You should, on your institutional level, you should have a love for God and a love for neighbor. And at a national level, the principles of the nation should also be built on those same things. Yep.
This insight helps me to see how wrong many have been at a national level in defining what a Christian nation is. And the United States of America, it prides itself of being a Christian nation. And they trace it back to their beginnings, and they say from their inception they were a religious nation. But this explanation is suggesting a different interpretation to what they have. And if they viewed the Christianizing process this way, many of the claims that the religious right are now making would never be made. They would be unjustifiable. And when you go to different nations, it's not just the US, even the British are claiming Christianity, and they're calling forward to preserving the Judeo-Christian West. And all of these claims are antithetical to what Protestantism truly was. And I think it's really helpful seeing it this way. It makes us interpret history better and what is transpiring better.
Amen. Thank you for that comment. That was really insightful. So that's what we're seeing here with this quotation. And this is how it ties into what we were mentioning last night with those principles. And what I want, the reason I keep bringing up those principles is what we're going to find, and hopefully what we can see, is that they work themselves into every single thing that you're going to find. Even in the message today, the idea of love for neighbor and love for God, or love for God and neighbor, is an all-encompassing theme that works its way into every single thing that God is ever trying to establish in His people or through His people, is highlighting those two things. Even at a national level, this is how a nation can be successful, is in these two principles. And we see that here even in the quotation. So that means, by compare and contrast, that means the Papal Europe here, which is this entity right here, is the opposite of all these things. It is the opposite of civil and religious liberty, or self-government and freedom of faith. It would mean that you do not have self-government. This is a monarchy. I decide what happens for you as the king, and I will also choose your faith, what the allowable faith is. And then we come down here, and it would also mean the same thing. It would be the opposite of republicanism and the opposite of Protestantism. Instead of the separation of church and state, it's the combination of church and state. Instead of a Republican nation, it is a dictatorial nation or an autocratic nation, depending on how you want to frame it. Same thing here with the principles. They do not have a love for God, a correct understanding and love for God, and they do not have a correct love for neighbor. They actually endorse the oppression of your neighbor. And that's something we'll see as well going forward. So the problem here that we're identifying is the history of Europe, of Papal Europe here, seen in this nice paragraph by Ellen White of these two things: royal oppression and priestly intolerance. Civil and religious liberty, oppression is what we're going to describe here as the fallow field. Does that make sense for everyone? We okay with that? So royal oppression, or we'll just say civil and religious oppression. Civil and religious oppression. And what did we say? The fallow field is the problem. Now we need to find the solution. And the solution is the plowing process, or it's at least part of the solution. So what did Sister White say about these two things of civil and religious liberty? Where do they find their roots for the United States? She mentioned it. She says the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. These two documents become the foundation of these principles. And we know that what happens, so we're identifying that the break in this chain is the American Revolution. And how does the American Revolution begin? With the Declaration of Independence. That's the document that begins that. Here. Declaration, I'm just going to put DOI. Declaration of Independence is what begins the breakup, and it initiates the American Revolution. So this is the point of, so here, 1776 is synonymous with the Declaration of Independence. The American Revolution begins. And eventually, we know, and we'll talk about this here in a minute, we're going to have the Constitution come into play. Anyone know the year? When was it? 1789 is when it's established or ratified. 1789. Though they were working on it the years before. So, yeah. Yep, a couple years before. And it gets established, the nation gets founded here in 1789. So now I want to focus on this history just for a little bit. And we're gonna put a pause on the history after. We're just gonna focus on here at the beginning for a while. And I'm going to erase. What? I'm not erasing the whole thing, just this little spot right here, so I can get some more working room. Maybe take a picture there, just in, okay. So I want to look at this here for a moment, because we know what is the agricultural model. What's another way of saying? What does it illustrate? What pattern?
Growth of plants.
The what?
Growth of plants. The growth of plants.
Oh, growth of a plant? Yes. Progression, yes. What? All of those are correct answers. I'm asking a bad question. What prophetic model does the agricultural model illustrate? What prophetic pattern does the agricultural model illustrate? It is synonymous with this pattern.
Small and bigger.
Yes, you're close. You're very close. What tool do we use all the time? Repeat and large, yeah. I mean, we have them on the walls. Some of them, at least back behind you guys. What? No, the reform lines. The agricultural model is, you were really close. The agricultural model is the reform line. Do we see that? It is synonymous. Every point on this line, this agricultural line, is a reform line. It's the exact same model. So this equals or tells you about what a reform line is. Right? Okay. So I want to add an element to this. And like I said, we're going to leave this history for a while and just focus here for a second. If we look at the reform line, what point is this on the reform line where the seed is sown? 9/11. Now, when we say 9/11, we mean there's a prophetic pattern event that happens there. I don't know the best way to say that. It is the empowerment of the first angel, and depending on what kind of line you're looking at, it could also be the arrival of the second. That's the waymark you're looking at. So this could be We could say this without saying 9/11 if we wanted to say it that way, but 9/11 is the best and easiest way to say it for simplicity. And we know that this point is here, what? The time of the end. So we have the time of the end, and we have the empowerment of the first angel, or 9/11. What is the time of the end? So let me clarify that question a little bit. In the context of, where do we get the idea of the time of the end, that verbiage? What? Daniel. And what is it in the context of? What's around it? So if we, for specifically, let's talk about Daniel chapter 12. What does it tell you? Knowledge increases. And what does that knowledge, what is the physical representation of that knowledge in Daniel chapter 12? Maybe you don't think about this, but light. It says the light, like the sun. It's light. Because it says that those who are wise, who understand that knowledge, are going to shine like the firmament. They're going to shine like the sun. So light becomes an illustration of wisdom or understanding, or the knowledge that is unsealed here at the time of the end. And what is the opposite of light? Darkness. So in the context of the time of the end, what do we say arrives here? Knowledge. Knowledge equals light. So what must you have had beforehand? Darkness. You were in darkness here. Or ignorance, yes. There's a lot of ways, a lot of things we can say here. And so darkness is the problem or the obstacle to the reform line that God wants to do, which is He wants to get to a point of harvest where He has perfect people or a perfect church, whatever the illustration, whatever context you're looking at. He wants to get you here, but He can't do that till He gets you out of darkness. That's the problem to this whole thing. He has to fix that problem. And so the solution is the introduction of light. So we see light arrive here. And this light is a contradiction to the darkness. And we know that it's knowledge in this sense, which means, as our brother said, ignorance is beforehand. So in the context of, and let's add to this a little bit, and what's going to happen to knowledge? It increases. So we have an increase of knowledge, and then what happens? You have the formalization of knowledge. So now let's take this pattern. Since we know that the agricultural model equals the reform lines, and we know that the plowing of the field here and the fallow field all illustrates this history, like we've said. So let's bring that up to here with the United States. So the darkness for the United States is civil and religious oppression, or ignorance on those things. And God is going to unseal a message, in this case, a message for a nation. And how does He unseal that message? What does it look like? The Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration of Independence here is how God is going to He's going to unseal knowledge. He's going to unseal a principle. And what principles are there? Well, if we want to know what the increase of knowledge, or the thing that's unsealed here, what do we have to do? We don't even need the Constitution. I can tell you, if I gave you this and you've never read the Declaration of Independence before, you could tell me exactly what's in it. How? If you've never read the Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, but specifically we're talking about the Declaration of Independence, if you've never read that document in your life and you've never even heard of it, but I put it on a line here and you understood the concept I was raising, you could tell me exactly what is in that document. How? It's going to contrast what was previously in the darkness, or the bad part here, the fallow field. So the opposite of civil and religious oppression would be civil and religious liberty. That's the opposite. So your light, whatever the message here, is going to be the opposite of what was there before. So the Declaration of Independence in its fundamental form is civil and religious liberty. So that liberty that we see here arrives in the form of the Declaration of Independence. But what's the problem with the Declaration of Independence? What is this line all about? What did we say? What is it? the growth of a nation. So, does the Declaration of Independence establish a nation? No. The Declaration of Independence is, and we'll mention this a little bit in a minute, it's a breakup letter. It's divorce papers. And so all that is it's just ending a previous relationship and saying this is what a nation should be based on, these principles. And we'll read about that momentarily. So it's not there yet. That message, those principles need to be formalized into what? Into a law that governs, that we can all say, okay, this is the governing principles, and we're putting it into a codified law, and we're all going to follow that, and it will establish this nation. When do we see that? 1789 with the Constitution. The Constitution codifies the principles or the spirit found in the Declaration of Independence. It takes those principles and said, this is what government looks like. This is what a government based upon those principles looks like.
So 1789 was when the Constitution went into effect?
It was ratified, yes, ratified. This is when the United States is born here. And what is interesting and what is important to note is that the formalization, or here with the Constitution, this point here always marks the birth of something. And we'll mention this, and just to give an example of this, what point is this? What is the formalization in our line? 1996. And what happened there? What?
No, she was there.
Either. Time of the End magazine. What else happened there, though? No. In terms of establishing something. Is that 1986? Yeah? 1986, okay. Yes, but stay on our reform line for the movement. How was the movement established in 1996? Say again? Yeah, who established that? Jeff. What was established in 1996? What? A messenger. How? What? No, not the Time of the End magazine. It's not that. It's there. What is formed right there? What does he get? What does Jeff receive in 1996? Not a message, not light. Think of institutions. Yes, that happens. Come on, you're missing the main thing. What ministry does he work for? Future for America. They get their name at the formalization, 1996. They become, not only do they make the Time of the End magazine and formalize that information, but that's when they get Future for America, they get the institution and the name in that year. All of those things happen right there, which is synonymous, or let me say it this way, synonymous is the wrong word. It is paralleled here to the United States. The United States officially becomes a nation in 1789 at the formalization of their message. So as a nation is formalized, a institution is formalized, a ministry is formalized at that same time. Do we see that? Okay.
Was it that time where different nations came together and formed the United States?
Say again?
Was it in that time when they came together and formed the United States?
Yes, that's right. That's 1789. So for the couple years before, all the states, the 13 colonies, they come together and they say, okay, we're all separate states. We need to form a united body. And they're going to establish the Constitution. And once the Constitution is passed by all 13 colonies, they all enter into the Union of the United States. And so they're one homogeneous group now, the United States of America. Now, it happens progressively in that they don't all ratify it at the same time, but it happens, this is when it's taking place. So let me add a little bit more information to this. So we identified that there's an increase of knowledge. Now, what is this increase of knowledge on? It's how to formalize, it's an understanding in how to formalize the ideas of this increase of knowledge. Of the information that was unsealed here. So let me see if I can just illustrate that a little bit or just talk to that. So if you have, I'm going to give you a tool. I give you a hammer. You've never used or seen a hammer in your life. So when I give you that hammer, two things are going to happen. The first thing that's going to happen is I'm going to explain to you what this hammer is. I'm going to say, this is a hammer. So what it does. And something still has to happen though. You have to take that hammer and you have to use it and get familiar with it. So you take your hammer and you start hitting stuff with it and you're like, no. You hit nails with hammers. You don't hit screws or you don't hit something else. I'm going to show you how to use a hammer, and then you grow some muscle memory and now you start understanding, you get the form and everything. Because whenever somebody uses a hammer for the first time, they're awkward. It's very awkward. Like anything, like any time you do something for the first time. So there's a muscle is being created here. So what muscle was being formed in this period here? What was being used? What was being learned about? What?
Which portion of the line are you talking about?
We're going to go with our line here. What is being formulated and what's being used and manipulated? All those words should help you. What? Reform lines. So the reform lines are the tool, and they're the muscle that the movement is going to begin to wrestle with and establish. And they're going to use it, and then eventually it's going to get formalized, and they're going to have this message based upon this tool that they have. The same thing happens here. Now, there's more to this history from 1776 to 1789, and I don't want to go into it in depth, but I just want to mention it. Does anyone know what is in between the American Revolution and the Constitution? The United States Constitution was not the first form of government that came to the United States. Anyone know what the first one was? It was, no, that was, it's going to turn into that was pre-revolution. And what they're going to create is the Articles of Confederation. It's their first attempt at creating a government. And I don't want to get into all the intricacies of it, but it was a broken system. It didn't work out. They had to close it down. It was a mess. But a lot of the principles in that first attempt that happened here of the Articles of Confederation, I'm just going to put AOC, those principles become what they use to create the Constitution. They actually copy and paste a lot of the stuff they put in there. And they work out all the kinks, because what happened was in the Articles of Confederation there's a lot of problems, but one of them was that it was too loose. It wasn't centralized enough. They weren't working together enough. They didn't have a federal government, a strong enough federal government to keep everyone together. And so there's all these issues. And so their first attempt fails, and they create a new one, and they fix all those problems, and it becomes what we had today. So the Constitution is actually the second attempt at government. And what I'm identifying as the Articles of Confederation is the increase of knowledge on how to use the tools or the message of the Declaration of Independence, of these ideas of civil and religious liberty. They still had some kinks that needed to get worked out. Until the point of formalization of 1789, where now you have an established message, you have an established institution here, and it's the identical thing for the movement. This is when Jeff is playing with the reform line. I say that. He's learning them, he's figuring them out, and then finally he's got them. In 1996, he understands how to use reform lines and what to do with them. Do we see that? We see that? Same thing? Okay. Now, Sister Antonisha said something earlier. She mentioned, and so she mentioned something earlier, and I think she took it from Sister Tamara. Did she take this from you? The idea that you said that the word coming up out of is the same in Revelation 13:1, right? You guys were mentioning that. So the word coming up, the phrase coming up out of, is the same in the translated word is the same in Revelation 13:1 when it's talking about the sea beast that comes out, as it is with the second beast in Revelation 13:11. So what does that mean? It means that we can put we should be able to apply the agricultural model also to the counterfeit, right? To the papacy, the first beast. So that's what I want to do now. So we're going to take just a minute to do that. I got to erase part of this. So we'll do that just for a little bit, and then we'll close with this presentation. I won't go much longer, and we'll finish up whatever we can do later. Okay, so let's make another one. So I need to just add one more point to this. So I'm going to erase the civil and religious. I'm going to erase this point here, the darkness, for a second, because when we look at our reform lines today, we have a new waymark other than just putting darkness. What do we have? Let me do it this way. Maybe you'll know what I mean. If I do this, what date is this? What? Not in this one. What is it in this date? 1979. 1979. What happens in 1979? A bunch of things. But what is 1979? What does it represent in terms of the time of the end? What's the relationship? It's a harbinger. So it is a harbinger, or it's pointing forward, saying these things are happening here at this waymark. If these things are happening, then you know the time of the end is coming. And it's always in a 10-year fashion, right? So 1989. 1989. Okay. So there's a 10-year history before 1776. So what would that be? That would be 1766. Now, we're not going to read it for sake of time, but in 1766, there's an act called the Declaratory Act. And what the Declaratory Act is it was an act by Great Britain that said the American colonies are in subjection to Great Britain and they have no say. It's basically because what they were doing, the context of that is that, as Sister Antonisha was saying, they have a Continental Congress. And basically what the Continental Congress is it's a local governing body in the United States where all the colonies come together and they start talking about the issues. They pass laws for themselves. And what England said is, you can't do that. You're not allowed to have your own local legislature like that governs you guys, because you're under the Parliament back in Great Britain. Does that make sense, the dynamic I'm setting up? So what they say is, we're passing this act, 1766, 10 years before, and this act says you are not allowed to govern yourself. You do not have self-governance. You are under the auspices, you're under the influence or the parliamentary rule of Parliament. And so it sets the tone. It sets the tone, and it is the harbinger for what's going to happen next. Because if they didn't pass, the Declaratory Act is a big part of the American Civil War. Because soon after you're gonna also have the Tea Party, things like that. Because England just digs their heels in and says you're not allowed to be independent. You're not allowed, or not even independent. America didn't want to be independent. They wanted to just have self-governance. They wanted to have representation. At minimum, America would never be founded as a nation if Parliament had allowed the United States to send representatives to Parliament. It never would have happened, but because they didn't allow that and they dug their heels in and said you will have no representation, that became a harbinger of what was to come with the American Revolution here in 1776. And we could read about that more. It's worth reading if you get a chance. But it points you forward to this event, and you can see the darkness and the light that's about to come struggling already, the two concepts.
So you can see the cause and an effect?
Yes, to some degree, it's a cause and effect. So we're now going to look at the counterfeit line for just a couple minutes. And we can do this quickly because we're all familiar with the history. So,
Are we reading as it is in Revelation 13, or are we reading as it now is?
I don't know what that means.
Are we, because if we're going to use the present line, there's 1899, But I'm questioning if we're doing a direct parallel to what the United States, a direct parallel to the United States line, which in my mind would make 1798, 538. If that's the way we're
Amen.
doing it, or?
Yes, we're doing it like that.
Okay.
Yes. So, as Sister Antonisha is saying, like we said before, we can look at Revelation 13 and look at that verse 1 and verse 11, they're parallels to each other. Both, something comes up. And the question is, when does Papal Europe become established? And Sister Antonisha is saying 538. We all okay with that? That's when the papacy, Papal Europe, this system of the sea beast is established as a that's when it really begins. So we'll put here, this is 538. So the United 1798 parallels 538. What is 538? What does it represent? It represents when they begin to rule supremely, right? As the nation of Bible prophecy. So that here is 538. So we'll say supreme. When does the United States rule supreme? When do they become the kingdom of Bible prophecy? 1798. So this is when the United States is going to rule supremely. In both those things. So you can see the parallel already. So we know if it's going to follow this pattern that we have to have a plowing time for the papal institution. But what did we say the agricultural model is all about? It's about problem and solution, right? So if we're looking at the papacy, so you have to think about this from a satanic perspective. So from Satan's perspective, what is the problem he has to deal with? What is his fallow field? Paganism. Paganism is the thing that's standing in the way of the papacy being what it's supposed to be. So we're going to put paganism here. So paganism needs to get taken away. When does paganism get taken away? 508. So 508, we see a removal of paganism, which is representing the problem that needs to get dealt with. But in 508, we also see, if you just give me a moment, gotta find it. Okay, this is from Uriah Smith. This is Daniel and Revelation. Okay, so I'm just going to read two passages. This is Daniel and Revelation 257.2. Let it be marked that in the year 508, paganism had so far declined and Catholicism had so far relatively increased in strength that the Catholic Church for the first time waged a successful war against both the civil authority of the empire and the Church of the East, which had for the most part embraced monophytes doctrine. The extermination of 65,000 heretics was the result. So this is when they're going to begin to wage a successful war against the Eastern Church and the civil empire here in 508. And there's going to be some consequences of that. Like it said, 65,000 people are going to be killed. One more quote. This is Daniel in Revelation 259.1. From these evidences, we think it clear that the daily or paganism was taken away in AD 508. This was preparatory to the setting up or establishment of the papacy, which was a separate and subsequent event. Of this, the prophetic narrative now leads us to speak. So he's going to talk about that in a moment. But what we want to see is the principles of a church and state relationship were taking place here in 508 when paganism is going to fall and Catholicism is now preparing itself to be set up as this supreme power later on. But what I want to see here is that the principles of papalism arrive in this year, now that paganism has dwindled and is being removed.
And it's somewhat ironical, or neat in my mind, that paganism is a reflection or a representation of union of church and state, whereas the papacy and its league with the kings is reflective of the separation of church and state. The papacy being a representation of the church and the kings being a representation on how we look at it, the papal entity is a counterfeit or a parallel, better yet, a parallel to what the United States of America constructed later on.
Amen. So these principles now arrive in 508. Paganism has been removed, which in this context, in the context of the United States, the daily is Great Britain. It's the papal, it's the darkness that gets removed that makes way for this rise of this empire, this new empire. So paganism here is the problem. The problem here is, as we said before, it's the Great Britain and the papal Europe, and there's that removal that's taken place. That darkness is being removed. That obstacle is being removed in both cases. And so I want to stop there for a minute before we go any further, and I want to identify that there's also a 10-year period here. So we can see a 10-year period before 508, and that puts us to 498, yeah. 498. So in 498 we have a solution, a harbinger of this event here. So let's just read about that for just a moment. So this is also from Daniel and Revelation. Daniel and Revelation 256.3. The conditions of the See of Rome was also peculiar at this time. In 498, the year we're talking about, Symmachus ascended to the pontifical throne as a recent convert from paganism. He reigned till AD 514. He found his way to the papal chair, says Hupin, by striving with his competitor even unto blood. He received adulation as the successor of St. Peter and struck the keynote of papal assumption by presuming to excommunicate Emperor Anastasius. So this Pope Symmachus, here in 496, is going to be the first pope to excommunicate an emperor and overthrow his civil power by religious means. Continuing on, it goes further. The most servile flatterers of the Pope now began, after this act, what he did of excommunicating the emperor, now began to maintain, this sounds familiar hopefully, that he was constituted judge in the place of God and that he was the vicegerent of the Most High. So with Pope Symmachus in 496, we see the excommunication of the civil power. So he's overthrowing the civil power, and he's also now beginning to be viewed for the first time, as I understand it, as the vicegerent of God standing in the place of Christ. So all of the DNA of what would happen here was visible in 498. Just like in 1766, the DNA of this history here is also present. Not only just the controversy over, the pagan removal that's about to take place, the pagan removal would be here, but the removal of Great Britain, but also the DNA of this whole history in that here, the issue was over representation, over being correctly represented or honestly represented in Parliament. And how do I say that? Basically, the idea of a representative government was here in 1766 with the American colonists who were eventually going to rebel 10 years later, in the sense that they were already trying to emphasize those principles, even though they wouldn't become substantial till the Declaration of Independence and after, but the DNA was there in both histories. In all these histories, we see that those DNA is present. And so Pope Symmachus, 10 years before, is going to do these things that we're talking about, and then it's going to lead to the removal of paganism in 508, and there's always an increase of knowledge that we identify. And that increase of knowledge is on the principles that are here, the papal principles. So these papal principles are going to have the knowledge of them is going to be increased until the point of formalization. When was the papal principles formalized and codified into law, just like all these other points? With what? Anyone? 533, Justinian's decree. So this is 533. And in 533, with Justinian's decree, it's the establishment, the codification of those papal principles. Because here, it was just the church believed it, the followers believed it, the church had power and whatnot. But now Justinian is going to take the civil power and said, this is law for the first time. And he's going to establish it as the religion of the empire, and he's going to give the papacy that corrector of heretics status that it had been seeking in a civil way. So we see the formalization here in 533 of those principles, and then subsequently we have the ruling supremely in 538, just like in 1798. There's this period of time where those principles, I don't know how to describe this period of time very well, honestly, but from this point forward, from 538, from 1798, from 9/11, this is where the movement or the United States or the Pope is going to begin ruling supremely after this preparatory time. So all of these histories are the plowing for their respective ones. But you have to look at the papal one from the satanic perspective of it was a perfect satanic work that Satan was doing. Yep.
I think you're right. I don't know if this is your intention, but in 2018, there had done a series of classes where he basically created a template with this diagonal line going upward, and then you have a crown where it almost plateaued and then it starts plummeting. So there's this rise, supremacy, and then the decline. And I think you're creating a similar structure, especially in my mind, where this supremacy, where that supremacy ends is where it started to plummet. And in my mind, I don't know if it's your thought, but like I shared, it seems to me that it's a similar structure that is going to be laid out there. And how I would describe that space is the growth or ascendancy of these different nations to prominence, and then they're prominent or they rule supremely for an allotted period of time. And beyond that period of time, they begin to plummet or fall.
Yeah, amen. And what we see is that I'm looking for a date. Give me 1 second. Okay. What you see in all of these histories, whether it's the United States or, we won't say the movement, but the United States or the papacy, is like what you're saying, there's this rise and fall. But what we always see is an overlap between the falling of one nation and the rising of another nation. And that's what's happening here, because if you look at this, we'll just put this here, I'll put that over here. If you look at this line here, this is 1798. 1798. You see the fall. You're seeing the fall of the papacy, but it hasn't fallen yet till 1798. The United States is already a kingdom, is already there. It's already an established nation, even before the fall. And you see the rise of the United States at that point. So you're seeing both things take place. You're seeing the rise and the fall taking place of that history. And I forgot, I'm missing a point with this. There's more to this that I'm missing in this moment. I'm missing it, but forget the Tea Party factors into this, 1773. I just forget how in this moment. But anyway, we see that overlap, like Sister Antonisha is talking about, this plateau that they're rising, they have this time of supremacy and then a decline. And the decline is always paralleled by someone else's ascendancy. Their ascendancy is during the decline of someone else. Anyway, so that is that. And so what we see here is that the United States and the papacy have identical beginnings. And both of them can be illustrated by the agricultural model here. And what's really interesting is that the work that is done by God and Satan in both of these histories is perfect. Satan is going to perfectly create a wicked empire, and God is going to perfectly create a nation that is the opposite of that. But both of them are going to see their supremacy and their decline. And in both cases, if you take the United States, we know if we get to the end of this line, the United States is going to start declining. There's this progressive fall where the United States is going to betray the principles it was supposed to uphold.
We're going to see a chiasm then at the end.
What do you mean?
What we saw at the beginning, are we going to see in the end reverse?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit, probably this afternoon, this evening. So the United States is going to decline, for what my point was, and what was I saying? Oh, they're going to eventually betray the principles that they had at the beginning, like you're saying. So the United States is going to start as a nation that is all for religious freedom and religious and civil freedom, but it ends up being a nation that goes against religious and civil freedom. And that's the same thing for the papacy. The papacy starts as a nation that is monarchical, as an empire that is monarchical, and it is dedicated to religious oppression and civil oppression. But by the end, as we know, and Sister Tessa's talked about this a little bit, by the end, they stop obeying their master, and they start going off against the principles he'd established here, which was the supremacy of the Pope, and they stop listening to the Pope, and they start, the supremacy of the Pope goes away, and now it is they're having to listen to the civil powers a little bit more. They start being less persecuty, so on and so forth. And I think that's what it was. I just reminded myself. One second. So, we'll come back to that maybe. Okay, anyway, so that's what we've been looking at so far. We're looking at how our agricultural model, the United States agricultural model, and the papal agricultural model all start the same. And you could finish the whole lines and go through that. We're not going to do it for time's sake, just showing the beginning of it. And we will pick up with this a little bit later. This afternoon we'll talk about the Declaration of Independence a little bit more, and talk about the chiasm that my sister is talking about, that it begins one way, or the oppositeness. It starts one way and it's going to end the opposite of how it began, and we'll talk more about that, and how all the principles of the fall of the United States are listed in the Declaration of Independence. Its fall was... the way it was going to fall was already listed in the Declaration of Independence. We'll talk what I mean by that a little bit later. But if you want to know what it looks like at the end, just do the opposite of what it was in the beginning. And so we'll mention that a little bit more. Okay, let us close with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for the light that you've given us, for this movement, for the tools and methodology where we can identify the way that you have worked and the way that you have allowed the opponent to work as well through these models and these principles. And we thank you that through this knowledge that you are making us wise unto salvation, and also wise unto the means in which we are to deal with these problems when we eventually go to the Levites and the Nethinims, Lord, and how we can use these lines and these principles to illustrate the problems in the world and in their conceptions, Lord. And we just thank you for that great gift and that privilege that you've bestowed on us. I pray that you would be with us now throughout the rest of this Sabbath break that we're going to have. And we pray that our lunch would be good, and we pray that you would guide us in our conversation and our actions throughout the rest of this day. In Jesus' name, amen.